the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone and my co-host is Caitlin Drake. Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church.
Today, our two guests are some of Boston Avenue's associate pastors, Reverend Sara, Pugh Montgomery, and Reverend Jen Logsdon-Kellogg. On today's episode, we're discussing New Year's, and in particular, New Year's resolutions. Good afternoon, ladies.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon. So first of all, just to be clear, there's nothing in the Bible about New Year's resolutions, correct?
That is correct. Nothing specifically in the Bible speaks to making New Year's resolutions, and certainly not at a particular time every year.
Now, the Bible doesn't mention New Year's resolutions. Is it still okay for Christians to make them?
Absolutely. This is Jen. I think the biggest thing to remember, though, is that our value and worth comes from our being made in the image of God, that we are beloved children of God no matter what. So there are plenty of places in the Bible where we are called to try to live more ethically, to try to pay more attention to how what we do affects other people, and to continually try to improve the way we have an impact on the world by loving God and loving other people. But it does not have anything to do with where our worth comes from.
Is there a similar biblical concept of taking an opportunity to improve yourself?
Well, there are a lot of places in the Bible that talk about self-improvement. And one of my favorites is the whole book of Proverbs really could be looked at as a self-help manual. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with Dave Ramsey, Financial Peace University. I will never forget that one of the things he prescribed for people who were trying to improve their financial situation was to read a proverb a day. In the New Testament, there are places where Jesus talks about, on the one hand, not worrying about tomorrow. So in Matthew 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a whole section where Jesus talks about not worrying about where your food's going to come from or where your clothing is going to come from, because God will take care of those things. But then in other places, he does talk about paying attention to how what you do affects others, and to be thoughtful. Like in Luke, he talks about not building a tower without first counting the cost. Then in Romans, Paul, and again, this is not anything to do with how we find our worth or how we are, quote unquote, saved, but that because we are Christians, we should seek to continually self-improve. So one scripture that I like to refer to there is Romans 12, 1-2, where Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and let what is God's will become more clear to you. So Paul talks continually about being transformed into the image of Christ.
During Lent, we give something up. That is often thought of in the same terms by many people as kind of a New Year's resolution. Is there any similarity between the two? Are they completely different?
Yeah, this is Sara, and that's a great question. There can be some similarity between the two in that, Lent and New Year's are kind of these start again times, so you can always just kind of mark those times and be able to have something new happen. But then there's also a difference with the way that we might approach what we're doing during those seasons. So a lot of folks kind of look at Lent as the time that we are asking ourselves about what we would want to take on or remove from our lives in order to be able to draw closer to God. Again, as Jen's been saying, it's not stressing about our value or our worth, but rather our relationship with God and with neighbor. And so trying to figure out how do we live our lives more wholly towards God. And so, but often New Year's resolutions, that you might approach them in a different way. So you might kind of not think about them in terms of how am I drawing closer to God, but a New Year's resolution might be more about how am I going to improve myself. And so it might be a little bit more, in a sense, ego-centered rather than God-centered. And so I would think that that's kind of, in all reality, the main difference between the two. But you can also just shift your own mindset and you can have them be exactly the same, because there's no reason why you can't have a New Year's resolution that looks very similar to a Lenten spiritual practice.
Especially from that clergy lens. You talked about that egocentric element to maybe some of our New Year's resolutions, Sarah, versus a more God-centered vision. So what are some important things maybe to keep in mind, or questions we can ask ourselves when making these resolutions? And I know that I have a hard time focusing on a particular goal or a particular resolution. So do you have any just strategies or advice when we're putting all of this together?
I think this is one of the questions where there could be several right answers. This is Jen. One of the ways that I approach making particular resolutions or goals is to first take a very big picture, long-term look at what I hope my life will look like. And so in my planner, there is a place for me to spend some time thinking about what I want my life to look like in a year, and in 5 years, and in 10 years, and at the end of my life. And then for my own self, I have created a personal mission statement that guides all of my decisions, I hope, that I make over the long term. So beginning with that long-term vision in mind, and again, with the idea being that my value and worth comes from my being a beloved child of God, but that ultimately I hope to become more and more Christ-like. And so what does that look like uniquely for me with my giftedness and with my family situation? What would that look like for me over the long term? So when I take New Year's or some new beginning in mind, I might take a fresh look, do another round of that long-term visioning, and then take my personal mission statement and use those things and kind of evaluate where does my behavior as it is now maybe not completely align with my personal mission statement, or where is my behavior counteracting that long-term vision that I have for my life, and pick just a couple of things to work on. And for me, I usually try to pick maybe one personal goal, one goal that has to do with my family, and one that has to do with my ministry. And then when I do set a goal, I try to use the SMART goal model, which is a common model. You can Google that, but it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. And so you identify how to measure when have you succeeded in your goal. Is it something that is relevant to that big picture vision? And is it something that you can achieve over a reasonable period of time? And then I identify which habits I might need to change in order to achieve that goal, and figure out how to track those habits and reward myself when I succeed in changing those habits. And finally, I try to find somebody that I trust to share, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and ask them to hold me accountable.
So this is Sarah. One of the things to add to what Jen just explained is something that my husband and I do. So we have, for New Year's, we always travel to the Outer Banks in North Carolina to be able to be with my friends. This will be our 20th year of being able to be together for New Year's. And so we have about a 4-hour car ride each way to the beach and then back from the beach. And so we actually use that car ride time to be able to chat with each other about evaluating our past year. So we kind of ask each other, what were some things within our past year that we are that we want to be able to celebrate? What were some goals that we each were able to meet? And then what are some ways that we feel like that that we could improve, and some things that we'd like to do better? And we often talk about a theme song that kind of maybe was our song for the past year, and then kind of talk about, okay, is there a song for this next year that we'd like to live into more? And that a lot of times also helps us in framing what the two of us together want to set as a new way of living into a new year. And so it's a great practice for us to do, as community and with each other, to kind of have that be a communal sense and a communal feel to exactly the process that Jen was just talking about.
Looking through the Lenten lens of becoming closer to God and growing spiritually, what are some examples of resolutions that might be good ones to consider for your faith formation or spiritual growth?
This is Sarah again. We're going to actually end up doing a spiritual practices calendar during this new year at Boston Avenue. And so if you are a person that listens to the podcast but doesn't physically attend the church, you can send us an email or somehow get in touch with us. You can check out our website and we can help send that spiritual practices calendar to you. Because those are some of the ones that, as a pastor, I would encourage you to be able to practice as new disciplines and new resolutions. Those are resolutions that are going to be more centered around, again, as Jen's been explaining, your right relationship with God and with the world. And so instead of trying to, figure out, hey, I'm going to lose 5 pounds and then, that donut looks really good, you're really more focusing on how am I called to love God and to love my neighbor a little bit better. And so these practices are centered around practices of Sabbath or of rest and of joy. Practices of repentance and confession, so kind of looking at how have we as community and we as individuals, how do we need to turn towards God more? Practices of paying attention to what God's already doing within the world. Practices of fasting and different ways that fasting can take place, and practice of simplicity and of common worship together. And so we would love to be able to give you that tool if you'd like to be able to use any of those practices and look through them as a way to maybe trigger an idea for yourself of this is actually a discipline that I'd like to take on.
Thinking about your areas of ministry, Jen, you're over our hospitality and evangelism. Are there new ways that we can think about that type of ministry, either as individuals or as a church, in our resolutions this next year?
Sure. There are several different things that you could resolve to do on this, but I have a couple of examples maybe to think about. One would be as an individual, or as a family, would be to get to know your neighbors. So I will never forget when I was a kid growing up, my grandfather, especially when I was a teenager and was beginning to look at going to college and having an adult life, my grandfather drilled into me, you've got to get to know your neighbors. Mm-hmm. And so maybe your resolution is to pick the 3 or 4 neighbors close to you and just think of something you can do every month or every 2 months throughout the year to get to know your neighbors a little bit better. Maybe take a plate of cookies over, maybe invite everybody for a block party. I'm not talking about the entire neighborhood necessarily, but maybe just the houses that are adjacent to yours. And not with any particular agenda other than to get to know them, to let them know that you care about what's happening in their lives, and just to develop a neighborly relationship. On the church side, I think that one of the things that our church could do, and I'm talking with a lot of Sunday school classes and kind of brainstorming about what this could look like, but to change our understanding of the word evangelism. So just redefining evangelism. There is a long history of the way we use the word evangelism that has become kind of problematic. And so because evangelism is based in personal relationships, redefining what we mean when we say evangelism, I've decided is kind of the starting point. And I would love for this year, and this does affect hospitality as well, I would love this year for our church to be able to come up with a common definition of evangelism that is unique and specific to our church and our community and our place within the community.
What about you, Sarah, in your area of ministry, thinking about missions or thinking about our church and society committees? What are some ways that we as individuals or as a church could rethink things or set resolutions around those areas?
I think that one of the best ways to be able to do that for missions is to really just, and in church and society and in many places of justice orientation, is to be willing to step outside of your comfort zone. I think that a lot of times within our mission work, we do the things that are easy for us, and we do the things that are sometimes not super challenging because it feels good for us. But the places that God is really going to impact our own growth and the places that we're going to really be shaped and changed are the places that are outside of our comfort zone. So it's when we are uncomfortable that we really have to rely and trust more on God. And so that might look, like being able to go and to, maybe read with kids if that's outside of your comfort zone, to commit to doing a practice like that, or to commit to coming and being a part of our compassion dinner ministries here at the church, and to sit beside somebody and to talk with them, and to really get to know your neighbor. I think there's also some wonderful things around missions in terms of also redefining. I loved what Jen was saying about that with evangelism, but with missions to also redefine the way that we approach missions within our life and within seeing each other, because a lot of times we see missions as we are coming to be able to provide this thing for you, and instead of seeing what another person could offer back to us and to this church and to the community or to us as individuals. And so I think that redefinition also of just taking each day and saying, how am I going to see the image of God in everybody that I meet? And how am I able to value that, and then to be able to see that of how that person could be in service and in ministry with me as well. And so that would be a wonderful resolution, and is a complete reshaping and redefinition for a lot of folks of what missions would look like.
Are there any common resolutions that you would offer caution about?
Yeah, this is Sara. Don't do one that you're not going to do well, y'all. Just don't set yourself up for failure. So again, we kind of said at the beginning, I love Jen's, talk about the SMART goals. It should be attainable. If you know that 3 weeks in, you're going to stop, don't do it. Don't have that be a resolution, because you don't want to do anything and set yourself up to think that you're a failure later on down the road. That's not what these, resolutions are not there to be guilt driven and guilt laden. That's not what we want as a church when we talk about resolutions.
And I would say, just to reiterate, make sure it's relevant to, not that you can't make some goals that are easy, hit them out of the park kind of goals, but is it a goal that really is relevant to how you want to be in the world? Mm-hmm. And certainly not to make any resolutions that would harm someone else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I would kind of add to, just in my own experience of many failed resolutions, make sure you're making it for the right reasons.
Absolutely.
If you're looking at making a resolution of going to the gym, are you doing it because that's a healthy place for you, or are you doing it because you feel like society has told you that's what you have to do, right? Mm-hmm. So what are your reasons, especially if we're thinking about our right relationship with God or our relationship with people in the world? I think our motivations are really important for that too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So do a pastor's New Year's resolutions look different than those of us regular old laity folk?
Absolutely. Ours are way more holy. And they're obviously easier to do because we are perfect. And so, of course, our resolutions look different no, they don't look different at all. Do you agree, Jen?
I would agree. I don't think our resolutions look any different. Although, I don't know about you, Sara, but I may be more angsty about, preparing my resolutions than a lot of people.
Yeah, we probably get a little bit more nerdy about our resolutions, perhaps, and kind of have a little bit more anxiety around them. But yeah, I think they're, just like anybody else. And so ours might sound different because of the way we're reshaping them, just like we're talking about reshaping, in terms of how we approach it. But they're the same.
Did either of you see through any of your 2019 New Year's resolutions?
Well, this is Sara, and my resolution in 2019 was to healthily give birth to baby girls. Well, I didn't know they were girls, but to twins, because I found out in January that we were pregnant with twins. So I knew that I was pregnant coming into the new year. And that was my only resolution, because I figured that is going to be my sole focus of the year, is to, for me to be healthy and to hopefully have some healthy babies. And we were, I was able to be able to carry them to 37 weeks, and they came out healthy and everything's been fine. So I say that's a successful resolution.
I would say my two main resolutions for 2019. One was to honor Sabbath. And I think that one I have really reshaped my habits around Sabbath, and I've become pretty successful at honoring a Sabbath. For me, it was really important to find one day that could consistently be Sabbath, which is something that I had not had until this year. So I did succeed in that one. The other one that I made, which I made alongside my husband, had to do with our personal family finances. And we did not do so well on that particular resolution, partly because of some changes that happened unexpectedly in the year with my appointment. I moved from a church in Oklahoma City to Boston Avenue in Tulsa, and I'm commuting from Edmond. So that made our budget look a lot different. But partly also just because of some habits that we intended to honor and set up and do together that we didn't necessarily follow through on as well as we could have or should have. But you know what? I'm giving myself a lot of grace because when circumstances change, when things happen that are unexpected, sometimes you just have to say, not now.
Have you made any resolutions for next year yet?
This is Jen. I am in an elaborate process right now of making my resolutions for next year. One of the things that I like to do and habitually have done is to take time off between Christmas and New Year's. And that's when I spend some time, honestly, in prayer and kind of reflecting on the past year and how my relationship with God shapes the way I move and be in the world. And so having that good, solid chunk of time away from my regular work routine is a part of my resolution-making practice.
Yeah, this is Sara, and I'd agree. We, that time that we have in the car on the way to the beach is usually the time that really kind of helps me be able to focus a little bit more on what that might look like. I probably don't have my resolution ready then by January 1st, and I'm completely okay with that. But I think that to really be able to set that space apart and to focus on that, I am thinking about more Sabbath and sort of carrying on that practice that Jen was talking about. That was a practice that I had wanted to take on during the season of Lent last year that I wasn't able to do quite as effectively. And so I'd like to be able to look at that practice. And then my husband and I are looking at the fact that, during this past year with the pregnancy and then with the twins coming into the world, we had a lot of chaos within our lives. And so that also led to not eating quite as well and being able to not be quite as healthy within the world. And so while our focus is not solely on losing weight, our focus is on being healthier so that we can be able to serve better. And to be able to be more alert and awake and active with all the girls.
I would like to add that you mentioned not having them ready by January 1st. There is no wrong time to make a resolution as well.
Correct.
So if July comes around and you think, you know what, I really want to start doing this, or this will let me become closer to God, help with spiritual formation, you can do it during any time of the year as well. So don't just think January 1st is when I make a change. It can happen at any point. There's no wrong time to make any resolution.
Absolutely not. That's why we talk a lot about the season of Lent. Could be, you might actually just take the first 2 months of the year to do kind of that reflection piece that Jen's been talking about, and to, maybe go through some of those practices, or to really sort of try some things out. And then when Lent hits, have that be your New Year's resolution time. So yeah, don't pressure yourself. You're okay. God still loves you.
So while I was digging around, doing a little base research for our podcast today, I found a mention of a study done by a professor at Scranton University named Dr. Norcross. All of those names sound made up, so I don't know if this is a real study.
Scranton's in Pennsylvania.
Well, Miss Northeast Coast. But one of the things that it said is that in his research, he broke out two groups of people. And the first group was made up of people who wanted to make a change and started it just at random dates. And out of that group, only 50% were living out the change 2 weeks after they began. and 4% were living out the change 6 months later.
Mm-hmm.
In his second group, they collectively began their change on the same day, and 71% were living out the change 2 weeks after, and 46% were living out the change 6 months later. So that's a huge difference in those numbers. So I wonder, thinking about church as community, which is kind of a framework that I operate from a lot with church, what is the role of community in our resolutions, and how do we as a church be community for each other in this new year?
This is Sara. I think that it's a great thing to be able to have community around your resolutions, especially if you're thinking about the resolutions in terms of being able to sort of realign you in right relationship with God and with each other, because we're not supposed to be doing this on our own. We have a worshiping community, and we want to gather together as people of God together, because other folks might be able to help affirm us within that. I think community can be there to help affirm, and they can also be there if you're starting to linger away from that. I think my practice of Sabbath during Lent last year did not go as effectively because I didn't have somebody to help hold me accountable to that. And so it was a lot easier for me to tell myself, oh, it's fine, I'll do it better next week. But if I had an accountability partner, they might kind of challenge me on that a little bit better. And I think that piece of challenge is a great way that community helps us stay the course and kind of stay consistent within that. It doesn't mean that they're going to shame you if you do anything completely wrong, or if you do end up not being able to fulfill that. But I think that there is a way that community does help shape us by being a part of that journey together.
This is Jen. I would also add that we don't always see ourselves very clearly.
Oh, yes.
And so sometimes the community is the best way to reflect back to you kind of the reality of how you are or are not living into the values that you have stated. And so holding each other accountable. And also the community can extend grace where we are reluctant to extend grace to ourselves. There is something to be said about you have to have developed a relationship and be in continual intimate relationship in community in order to give people the ability to hold you accountable. So for us to just tell people that we're not in close relationship with how they could be doing life better, that is not appropriate. But where we are in intentional Christian community, and we are intentionally extending grace to each other on a regular, continual basis, and growing in relationship with God and with one another, that is where it is appropriate to ask people to hold you accountable, and before you extend advice, to make sure that advice is welcome.
Yeah, and this is Sara again. We are doing a class in January that we would love to be able to invite y'all to, if anybody would like to join us, where you'd be able to form that better sense of community and to be able to be with each other and to have that trust and that respect. I'll be teaching a class on the Wednesday nights in January from 6:30 to 7:30, and it's around having a guiding word for your year. And so it's a practice that we call Star Words, not to be confused with Star Wars. It's very hard to differentiate the two. But that Star Words is this word that you pick up that God is giving to you as a gift. And so you're able to use that word that God gives you and to set forth the ways that you want to live within that word throughout the year. And so if you'd like to be a part of that, we'll have a community of folks that you can form those relationships with and be able to continue to journey alongside one another. And so that will be on Wednesday nights, I believe starting the first right after, so January 8th.
I would like for Caitlin to know that I also knew that Scranton was in Pennsylvania.
That's
but it's 100%
right.
because of The Office. Because that's where that takes place.
That's right.
100%. That's the only reason that I knew that was in Pennsylvania. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I would just like to add that I hope that you have a wonderful time setting these goals for yourself, and to be able to know that God loves you no matter what.
Thank you very much for being here today. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We are located at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.